When the news broke, the world could hardly believe it. Pope Francis, the man who had spent a lifetime walking lightly upon the earth, had left behind a fortune, not a fortune measured in the gold and grandeur so often associated with the halls of power, but something even more startling: tangible wealth amassed quietly by a man who had outwardly renounced it. It seemed almost a contradiction. A pope who drove a battered Ford Focus, who lived not in palatial rooms, but in a humble guest house, who refused a formal salary, now revealing from beyond the grave a legacy that no one had expected at the Vatican. Those who worked under him, clerics, administrators, even simple staff members, typically earned modest salaries ranging between €4,000 and €5,000 a month, enough for a simple life in Rome, but hardly extravagant. Pope Francis had made it clear from the start he would take nothing more than he needed, and yet, when his family gathered back in Argentina, carefully opened the sealed documents and belongings he had left behind, what they found brought more than surprise. It brought tears. Reports quickly surfaced, with journalists like Jesse Waters amplifying the astonishment now rippling through Vatican corridors. A sealed last will and testament, quietly prepared and stored away, was now at the center of a mystery. How did a man who famously lived with so little leave behind something so significant? What lay hidden behind that final envelope was not just about money, it was a reflection of a life lived deliberately, a life that spoke louder in its simplicity than any speech could. From the moment Jorge Mario Bergoglio had stepped onto the Vatican balcony in 2013, accepting the call to become Pope Francis, he had set a tone unlike any of his predecessors. The traditional trappings of papal splendor, the red velvet shoes, the ornate papal apartments were set aside. Without hesitation, he opted instead for a small room in the Deus Sancti Mathi, the Vatican guest house, where he shared meals with visitors and treated everyone from cardinals to cooks with the same quiet warmth. There was no imperial distance, no grand ceremony, just a man living as plainly as the gospel he preached. Francis declined the standard papal salary, a sum estimated to hover around $32,000 per month, insisting he had no need for it. Publicly, he claimed that wealth and privilege were temptations he must refuse. He would often laugh off questions about pensions, properties, and financial securities, waving them away like a distraction from the true work of a shepherd. The shepherd must smell like the sheep, he once famously said, not merely a slogan, but a mission statement he embodied every day. Everything about his life choices reflected that ethos. Instead of gliding through Vatican streets in gleaming Mercedes limousines, he chose a simple Ford Focus, battered with time and miles, but fitting for a man who believed that proximity to the poor was more important than prestige. He blessed crowds of Harley-Davidson bikers, not from afar, but up close, later auctioning the gifted motorcycle for charity rather than keeping it as a trophy. He sold luxury cars when they were offered to him, often directing the proceeds toward housing for refugees or food banks for the hungry. Wherever he went, Francis brought the fragrance of simplicity and a challenge to all who would follow. Most assumed, therefore, that when he passed, Pope Francis would leave behind nothing more than a battered Bible, a few well-worn books, and the lingering echo of his sermons. The Vatican's immense institutional wealth, estimated between 10 and 15 billion, was understood to be just that, institutional. Francis, everyone believed, owned nothing. He dined modestly. He avoided lavish renovations. He spent more time with janitors than with diplomats. His personal records suggested he had no private bank accounts, no real estate holdings, no retirement nest egg. His wealth was supposed to have been spiritual, not financial, and yet now the revelation of the sealed envelope was forcing the world to rethink, because inside it was not just an inheritance, it was a story that defied easy assumptions, a story woven through years of quiet decisions no one had noticed for years. Vatican insiders would say with a shrug, if Francis leaves anything, it'll be a few tattered books and a smile. And outwardly that seemed true, but behind the sacred walls, hidden in the shadowed spaces where tradition and modernity often clashed, there were faint murmurs, hints that perhaps not all financial matters were as transparent as they seemed. Very few paid attention at the time. After all, this was the Vatican. It operated with layers of confidentiality deeper than any government on earth. But now, in the days after Francis's passing, sharper eyes were beginning to peer backward. People were asking uncomfortable questions. If he truly declined all income, what became of the unused salary? Were their funds quietly set aside without public fanfare? Was there a deeper story behind the Pope who refused riches? One particular incident fanned the flames of curiosity. The moment when, after the envelope was opened, a woman closely tied to Francis's Argentine roots broke down in uncontrollable weeping, not from greed or shock, but from something far more profound, because what Francis had left behind was not merely money, it was a final, deliberate act of love, a legacy carefully sown in silence, now blooming in the light. But before we reach the heart of that moment, we must understand the subtle financial realities that had shaped it. At the Vatican, things are rarely simple. When a pope refuses his monthly stipend, the funds don't simply evaporate. Vatican financial operations, bound by both ancient canon law and modern policy, redirect such funds sometimes to charities, sometimes to internal budgets, and sometimes, if authorized, to Holding accounts set aside for special purposes, it appears that while Francis publicly refused to touch his salary, the Vatican continued budgeting for it, quietly, reverently, without fuss. Over the years, a modest but significant sum accumulated, earmarked not for personal luxury, but for discretionary use. A trust account tied to Francis's name quietly grew in size, shielded from public knowledge, but always under his moral direction. He had not gathered it for himself. He had not sought it for status. He had kept it carefully, prayerfully, for a purpose. Only he knew, a purpose that would bring a continent to tears. And now that story was about to unfold. The discretion with which Pope Francis handled his personal affairs was not accidental. It was woven deeply into the fabric of his character, so subtle, so understated, that even those closest to him rarely realized the full scope of what he was doing in a world obsessed with appearances. It seems paradoxical that a man who preached poverty, lived with simplicity, and carried himself as a servant could still possess the means to direct 6 figures a year without attracting public notice. But that was the enigma of Francis. He was never interested in optics. He cared only about intent, and intent, as it often does, can hide profound things in plain sight. His vision of the Church's mission had always been clear. The path of Jesus started on the peripheries. It moved toward the poor, and with the poor toward everyone else. It was never about show, it was about substance, and in that quiet conviction Francis found the space to live out a radical paradox. A pope who owned almost nothing, yet quietly stewarded a resource not for himself, but for those he loved, and never stopped loving. Historically, popes had access to their stipends freely. They used these funds for travel, gifts, personal upkeep, and in some cases to secure comfort in retirement. There were few questions asked. It was the way things had always been. But Francis chose another path. He funneled the money not into palaces, not into endowments bearing his name, but into places where the world rarely looked: homes for abandoned orphans, clinics for the impoverished, scholarships for young men studying theology in forgotten corners of the earth. Most of these donations went unnoticed. The world saw a pope who lived humbly. It did not see the quiet hands reaching across oceans to lift those who would otherwise remain invisible. Unlike many modern figures, Francis never established a personal foundation. He never allowed his name to be etched into marble buildings or golden plaques. Instead, there is now mounting evidence that he worked through trusted intermediaries, 2 men linked to Jesuit financial circles across Latin America, who helped set up and manage a trust fund that slowly, quietly grew year after year. There were no fanfares, no charity galas, no public reports, just quiet, careful stewardship designed not to glorify but to serve. Why the secrecy? Why not simply announce these acts of generosity? Vatican insiders who knew him well now suggest it was his way of honoring the vow he made long ago to the world. He would appear a man detached from riches in his heart. He would remain a man committed to provision, not for himself, but for others. He never wanted wealth to distort his mission, nor to create scandal or confusion about his true priorities, and so the fund grew quietly, accumulating behind a curtain no one thought to draw back. Few ever guessed that any part of it would be intended for his family. Throughout his papacy, Francis rarely spoke about his relatives. He kept that part of his life protected, shielded from the storms of public life. But when he did mention them, the affection was unmistakable, reserved, yes, but deeply real. During one interview, almost as an afterthought, he referred to his sister Maria Elena as the one person who remembers who I was before all of this. At the time, the comment passed without notice, but now, in the light of unfolding events, those words have taken on a haunting weight. Maria Elena Bergoglio had lived her life far from the spotlights that surrounded her brother. She remained in Argentina, tucked away in a modest neighborhood, never trading her identity for fame or access. Even when her health began to falter, even as years brought greater hardship, she refused to capitalize on her connection. She lived simply, quietly, raising her family with the same unpretentious dignity she had been raised with. Reporters occasionally sought her out, hoping for an exclusive glimpse into the Pope's private world, but they found little. No luxury vehicles parked outside her home, no marble statues in her garden, no glossy interviews or memoir deals. Maria Elena was and remained a woman of quiet resistance, resisting the law of fame, resisting the temptation to become part of the spectacle. But what no one saw was the invisible thread that bound her to her brother. Still, week after week, Francis wrote to her, not letters full of theology or church politics, but simple human letters, notes of encouragement, updates on his health, jokes about old family memories, each signed not as Pope Francis, but simply H, and always, almost without fail, he closed with the same 3 words: Quiet Hermanita, take care, little sister. Their bond remained untouched by the distance, unchanged by the white cassock, and the papal ring. It remained rooted in the dusty streets of Buenos Aires, where 2 children had once laughed and played without knowing what fate would one day ask of them, where Jorge Mario had once defended her from bullies, where after their father's death he had quietly stepped into a role far heavier than his years, protecting her without ever making her feel burdened. When the white smoke rose in 2013 and the world cheered the election of a new pope, Maria Elena did not rush to Rome. She stayed behind, not because she lacked pride, but because her brother had asked it. The money it would cost to fly across the ocean, he had said, could feed and clothe dozens. Pray from home, he told her. that's more than enough. And she did every day quietly, faithfully, even as her own life grew harder, as a devastating stroke robbed her of her voice for a time. She never wavered, she never complained, she never sought special treatment, she simply carried on, a quiet sister to a brother who had become a symbol for billions, but remained for her just Jorge. Now, in the aftermath of his passing, the fullness of his silent preparations was beginning to emerge. The trust fund he had stewarded in secrecy was not a monument to his legacy. It was not a political maneuver. It was in its purest form a brother's last gift to his sister, a love letter written not in ink, but in sacrifice, and the world was about to see just how deep that love had run through it, all the decades of distance, the weight of fame, the ever-widening ocean between their lives. He was always there, not in grand gestures or public declarations, but in the quiet spaces where real loyalty lives, in whispered prayers offered under a foreign sky, in the warm crackle of a phone call late at night, in the unspoken knowledge that no matter how high the world lifted him, his heart remained tethered to the dusty streets of Buenos Aires, and to the sister who never asked for anything but remembered everything. There is a kind of loyalty that doesn't make headlines, it doesn't glitter, it doesn't beg for applause, it simply endures, quietly holding the weight of shared memories when everything else changes. Maria Elena embodied that kind of loyalty. She never asked for favors, never once used her brother's position to secure her own comfort. She turned down invitations to Vatican functions, politely declining to step into the spotlight. She had no desire to share. "I would not distract him," she once told a neighbor. "When pressed, he carries enough without carrying me too." But Pope Francis never forgot, even as his world expanded beyond imagination, even as papal documents, audiences, and travels consumed his days, he carried her, and the memory of what they had been before. The world called him Holy Father. She was, after all, the last of them, the last living member of the small struggling family that had once gathered around a kitchen table in Argentina to pray over simple meals and laugh through difficult times in his final years, particularly after a series of health scares that left him visibly weakened. Those closest to Francis noticed a change. He asked more questions about legal matters. He inquired discreetly about trusts, about guarantees, about how to make sure that something important could be secured without causing scandal. He never spoke Maria Elena's name in these conversations. He didn't have to. Everyone close to him understood, who lived at the center of that quiet urgency, and when his health took a sudden sharp turn in early 2025, Vatican aides confirmed that one of his last personal requests, even as he prepared his soul for the final journey, was to send a sealed envelope by secure courier to a modest home in Buenos Aires, to a woman the world had barely seen, but who had never once let him forget who he truly was. The envelope arrived quietly. A man in a dark suit rang Maria Elena's bell, handed her the thick cream-colored envelope sealed with a simple wax crest, and left without a word. There was no media fanfare, no procession, no photographers waiting outside, just the profound, trembling silence of a sister holding what felt less like a document and more like a final embrace. She did not open it immediately. Neighbors later said she pressed it to her chest and closed her eyes, as if holding it closer might make the distance disappear, as if for a moment she could feel her brother standing beside her again, just as he had when they were children, and the world was smaller, kinder, and less heavy. While she sat in silence, nearly 7,000 m away, a different kind of reveal was unfolding on American television. Jesse Waters, seated at his studio desk, leaned forward with the air of someone holding a secret too big to keep. His opening words were sharp. "We've got the Pope's last will and testament." Across television screens, viewers leaned in, expecting perhaps a theological reflection, a final papal blessing, a moral teaching, but what followed stunned even the most seasoned observers. Waters unfolded a document and pointed to a line with deliberate emphasis. "This," he said, tapping the paper, "is a legal acknowledgement of a trust fund managed quietly for over a decade, with explicit instructions for dispersal to one individual, Maria Elena Burgio." The world blinked in the background. The screen lit up with a simple, clean graphic, no sensational headlines, just facts. A Vatican-managed fund, annual deposits, conservative investments, accrued interest, a sum speculated to rest somewhere between the high six figures and low seven figures, and more importantly, a mission attached to it. According to sources close to the trust, Pope Francis had spent years diverting unused papal stipends, royalties from his writings, and private donations into this discreet account, not for luxury, not for retirement, but for the sister who had prayed for him long before the world ever did, and for the people she still lived among. The reaction online was instant and electric. When Pope Francis passed, the world was stunned to learn he had left behind a secret trust, quietly accumulated over years, not for wealth or luxury, but to serve others. His sister, Maria Elena, living modestly in Buenos Aires, received a letter in his familiar handwriting. It thanked her for a lifetime of silent loyalty and revealed that the trust was hers to oversee, not for personal gain, but for health care, education, and aid in their community. The Vatican confirmed all finances followed proper protocol, yet questions and admiration swept the globe. To Maria Elena, it wasn't about money. It was about love, humble, invisible, enduring love. She never sought the spotlight. Instead, She honored his legacy through quiet service, ensuring every peso went to the people who needed it most. The trust sparked a global movement, giving anonymously, helping without seeking praise, the Bergoglio way. Clinics rose, scholarships grew, and hope returned to forgotten places. Francis's true legacy was not wealth or status, but a life of silent generosity. And in the quiet of her home, Maria Elena continued his mission. She didn't need monuments or applause. Her brother hadn't just preached humility, he had lived it. And in the end, he gave everything not to be remembered, but because he remembered.